On the night of June 15th, 2026, the ground near Palu, Indonesia, did something it was not supposed to do. It dropped. A magnitude 6.7 earthquake tore open the crust just off the coast of one of the deadliest disaster zones on the planet, and when seismologists read its fingerprint, they found a mechanism that did not match the catastrophe that made this place infamous. The same ground that tore sideways at record speed years ago had now pulled apart and fallen, and the earthquake itself, frightening as it was, may not be the real danger. The danger is what that strange new motion, and the shocks already spreading around it, might be telling us about what this fault is preparing to do next. Before we get into it, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and drop a comment to tell me where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The Flat Line. A seismograph is built to wander. The needle, or these days the glowing line on a screen, is supposed to drift and wobble and trace the ordinary restlessness of a planet that never fully holds still. On a quiet night it draws something close to a gentle scribble, the background hum of distant waves and faraway traffic, and the slow breathing of the crust beneath our feet. So when that line goes flat, when it stops wandering and instead slams from edge to edge in a single violent smear of ink, something has gone wrong somewhere, and the only question left is how far away and how big. On the night of June 15th, 2026, a line went flat. A station watching the Western Pacific pinned itself against the limits of its own scale, the trace blowing out into a solid black wall, and the first number to flash up beside it was a magnitude 6.3. That alone would have been enough to make a long night for somebody. A 6.3 is not a small earthquake. It is the kind of event that can crack walls, drop ceilings, and send people running into the street in their bare feet. But the number did not stay at 6.3 for very long, and that is where this story really begins. Because the data was preliminary. The source parameters, the precise measurements of how much the ground actually moved, had not yet been reviewed by a human seismologist. The machines had made their first guess, and their first guess was already being revised upward as more stations across the region reported in and the picture sharpened. 6.3 became something larger. Within minutes, the European agencies and the American agencies were converging on a different answer, a heavier answer, and the heavier answer was this. A magnitude 6.7 by the reckoning of the United States Geological Survey, a magnitude 6.8 by the European Mediterranean Seismological Center, and by some local and regional networks closest to the shaking, a number that climbed all the way to 6.9. Now, you might wonder why 3 different agencies give 3 different numbers for the same earthquake, and whether that means somebody is wrong. They are not wrong, they are simply early. A spread of 2 or 3 tenths of a magnitude unit in the first hour after a large quake is completely normal, and it reflects nothing more sinister than different instruments, different methods, and the slow work of refining a final answer from a flood of incoming data. What matters is not the disagreement. What matters is the direction. Every revision pushed the number up, not down, and an earthquake that gets bigger the longer you look at it is an earthquake worth paying very close attention to. So we had our magnitude. We had our flatline station thousands of miles away, lighting up so cleanly that observers watching the traces in real time could see the spike arrive on stations as far off as Japan, a sharp, clean jolt standing tall above the background noise, and once the location resolved, once the dot settled onto the map in its little circle of alarm, the name attached to that dot changed everything. The earthquake had struck off the coast of Central Sulawesi, in Indonesia, roughly 27 miles, about 43 kilometers, to the east and slightly south of a city called Palu. Hold on to that name, because the entire reason you are here, the entire reason this is not just another number scrolling past on a seismic feed, lives inside that one word, Palu. To most of the world it means nothing. To a seismologist it is one of the most haunted pieces of ground on the planet, and a strong shallow earthquake landing right on top of it is not the same as a strong shallow earthquake landing in some empty stretch of ocean. The location is not a detail. The location is the story. Let me tell you what we actually knew in those first chaotic minutes, before the analysis, before the history caught up with the headline. We knew the magnitude was somewhere between 6.7 and 6.9, and that it would likely keep being refined. We knew it was shallow, although exactly how shallow would take a little longer to pin down. We knew it had announced itself on instruments across an entire hemisphere, and we knew that the agencies were still catching up to it, the United States Geological Survey not even reporting it on their public map at first, which sent observers scrambling to the European models and the regional networks just to confirm that what they were seeing was real. It was real. The waiting only made it heavier. There is a particular kind of dread in watching a major earthquake exist on the foreign stations, on the Japanese traces and the European solutions, while the official catalogue you trust most sits silent, still processing, still deciding what to call the thing that has so obviously already happened. You sit there refreshing the page, asking the agency under your breath whether it is awake, whether it has seen this yet, and the longer the silence stretches, the more your mind fills it with possibilities. And then the page updates, and the number is there in black and white, reviewed and confirmed, and somehow that does not make it feel smaller. It makes it feel official. It makes it real in a way that a preliminary estimate never quite is. This is the part I need you to sit with before we go any further, because it is the spine of everything that follows. A major earthquake struck Indonesia on the night of June 15th, and the magnitude, as alarming as it was, is not actually the most important thing about it. The most important thing is where it struck, and what that specific patch of crust has done before, and the strange, almost unsettling way it chose to break this time. Those three things together are what turn a 6.7 into something that made experienced earthquake watchers stop, lean toward their screens and quietly say, "I knew it." Because they had been watching this region. The wider neighbourhood, the corner of the world where the Philippines and Indonesia crowd together along the western edge of the Pacific, had been getting hammered. There had been a much larger earthquake just days earlier, a genuine monster, and a scatter of smaller, strong quakes rattling through in the time since. The feeling, among the people who watch these things closely, was that the region was not finished, that something bigger might be brewing, and then, on a Monday night, into the middle of that uneasy quiet, the ground near Palu dropped. Notice what I just said. The ground dropped. Not slid, not tore, not ground sideways past itself. It dropped. And if you know anything about what happened in Palu the last time the earth there came apart, that single word should make the hair on your arm stand up because it is the wrong word. It is not how this place is supposed to break. The last time, the ground did something else entirely, something so fast and so violent that scientists had to invent new language to describe it. And that mismatch, that quiet wrongness in the mechanism, is the first thread we're going to pull. So before we touch the history, before we walk back into the worst day this region has ever recorded, we need to understand exactly what the instruments were telling us about how this particular earthquake moved. Because buried in that data, in a handful of numbers that look like gibberish to most people, is the first clue that this was not a repeat of the past. It was something new. And in a place like Palu, new is not necessarily better. There is something worth understanding about how we even knew this earthquake had happened so quickly, because it speaks to the strange interconnected nervous system we have wrapped around the planet. The Earth is wired. Scattered across every continent and sunk into the seafloor in places are thousands of seismic stations, instruments sensitive enough to feel the ground move on the far side of the world. When a fault breaks in Indonesia, the waves it sends out race through the body of the planet and arrive, minutes later, at stations in Japan, in Europe, in the Americas, each one recording the same event from its own distant vantage point. That is how a station thousands of miles from Palu could pin itself against its own limits and tell observers that something large had just happened. The planet felt it nearly everywhere at once, and the network turned that shared feeling into a number. But turning the raw shaking into a trustworthy magnitude takes time, and this is where the word preliminary carries so much weight. When the first automatic estimates flash up, they are the work of computers making a fast first guess from incomplete data, and computers, for all their speed, can be fooled by the messiness of a real rupture. That is why the early numbers carry a warning that the source parameters have not yet been reviewed by a seismologist, that a human expert has not yet checked the machine's work. In the first minutes, the magnitude genuinely is up in the air, and a 6.3 can climb to a 6.7 or a 6.8 as more stations report and a person finally sits down to refine the answer. And that gap between the automatic first guess and the reviewed final answer is one of the quietly unnerving parts of watching a major earthquake unfold in real time. You can see the event on the foreign stations plain as day, while the official catalogue you trust most still shows nothing, still grinding through its review. The earthquake has obviously happened, the ground has obviously moved, but the system has not yet blessed it with an official number, and so you sit in that limbo, watching a disaster exist on some screens and not yet on others. For Palu, that limbo did not last long, and when the reviewed number finally landed, it confirmed what the distant stations had been signalling all along. This was a major earthquake, in the worst possible place, and the machine and the human had now agreed on it. What were those numbers, and why did the shape of this rupture make seismologists tilt their heads? That is exactly where we're going next. Part 2. Reading the beach ball. Every earthquake leaves a fingerprint, not just a magnitude, not just a location, but a description of the actual motion, the geometry of how one slab of rock moved against another in the instant of failure. Seismologists capture that geometry in something they call a focal mechanism, and they draw it as a little shaded sphere, black and white, quartered like a beach ball. To the untrained eye, it looks like a logo, a meaningless design. To someone who can read it, that little ball tells you, at a glance, what kind of violence just happened far below the surface. And the beach ball that came back for the Palu earthquake was telling a very specific, very surprising story. Let me translate the numbers, because they matter, and because once you understand them, you will never look at an earthquake report the same way again. The United States Geological Survey published what they call a moment tensor solution, which is the formal mathematical description of the rupture, and it described two possible fault planes. One plane oriented at a strike of about 284 degrees, dipping at 55 degrees, the other oriented at about 106 degrees, dipping at 36 degrees. And then came the number that actually mattered, the number that decoded the whole thing, the rake. The rake values came in at about minus 91 degrees on one plane and minus 88 degrees on the other. I know that sounds like a string of coordinates from a navigation system, so let me tell you what the rake actually is, because it is the key to this entire video. The rake is the direction the rock slid along the fault. It is the answer to a simple question: did the ground slide sideways, or did it slide up and down? And the answer is hidden in that single value. A rake near 0 degrees, or near 180 degrees, means the rock slid sideways, the two blocks scraping past each other horizontally like two cars sideswiping on a highway. That sideways motion is called strike slip, and it is the signature of faults like the famous San Andreas in California. But a rake near minus 90 degrees means something completely different. It means the rock dropped. When the rake sits right around minus 90, as it did here, you're looking at what is called normal faulting. Normal faulting happens when the crust is being pulled apart, stretched, placed under tension, and one block of rock loses its grip and slides downward relative to the other, along a slanted plane. Picture two hands pressed together and then slowly drawn apart, and imagine a wedge of rock in the gap between them suddenly giving way and dropping into the widening space. That is normal faulting. That is extension. That is the crust quite literally coming apart and a piece of it falling. And that, according to the instruments, is what happened near Palu on the night of June 15th. Now here is why a seismologist's head tilts at that. Here is the quiet wrongness I promised you. The last time Palu made headlines around the world, the last time this ground tore itself open and thousands of people died, the motion was not a drop. It was a sideways tear. It was strike slip, the rock grinding past itself horizontally, the same family of motion you see on the San Andreas. The earthquake that defined this place, the one written into every textbook and every hazard map, was a sideways event. And now, just a few miles away, in the same haunted zone, the ground had broken in almost the opposite way. It had pulled apart and dropped. That mismatch is not a small thing, and I do not want to rush past it, because it sits at the center of everything we're going to explore. Same region, opposite mechanism. The fault system that tore sideways at record-breaking speed in the past had now expressed itself as extension, as crust falling into a gap, and the observers checking that beach ball again and again, hours into the night, kept confirming the same answer. It still looked like normal faulting. The rake values stayed parked around minus 88 to minus 91. This was not a clerical error. This was the ground genuinely choosing a different way to fail. So what does it mean when a place breaks one way and then breaks another way entirely? Does it mean the danger is lower because this was not the same kind of rupture that caused the last catastrophe? Or does it mean something more unsettling, that the stresses inside this zone are so tangled, so multi-directional that the crust can fail in completely different styles depending on which knot lets go first? Keep that question alive, because the honest answer is the entire reason the experts are uneasy rather than reassured. To understand why the mechanism flip is so strange, you have to understand that most simple faults break in mostly one way. A clean, straightforward fault has a personality. It is a sideways fault, or it is a dropping fault, or it is a thrusting fault that shoves one block up and over another. It tends to repeat its character, because the forces acting on it are consistent. But the ground beneath Palu is not simple, and the fact that it can produce both a violent sideways tear and a downward drop within the same small region tells you that you are not looking at one clean fault at all. You are looking at a tangle. You are looking at a zone where the crust is being pushed and pulled and sheared all at once, and where different pieces of that tangle can let go in different directions. That complexity is going to matter enormously when we talk about what comes next, because a tangled, multi-directional fault zone is far harder to predict than a simple one. With a simple fault, you can at least say, here is how it usually breaks, here is roughly how often, here is what to brace for. With a tangle, the rules blur. The same ground that just dropped quietly tonight is threaded through with the very strand that tore catastrophically before, and the two are not strangers. They are neighbours, sharing the same stresses, feeding off the same slow collision of the plates, and shallow. Do not forget shallow. Whatever the exact style of this rupture, it happened close to the surface, and that single fact took a 6.7 and handed it the power to behave like something larger. Before we walk back into the history that makes this place so feared, before we stand in the wreckage of what happened here years ago, I want you to understand why a relatively modest magnitude, breaking only a few miles down, can punch so far above its number that people more than a minute's walk from collapse still feel the floor try to throw them. It is worth pausing on how scientists even produce that beach ball, because the method is a small miracle of physics, and it explains why the result is so trustworthy. When an earthquake's waves arrive at all those stations around the world, they do not arrive the same way in every direction. A station in one direction might first feel the ground pull toward the rupture, while a station in another direction first feels it push away. By collecting those first motions and the full shapes of the waves from stations scattered all around the globe, seismologists can work backward, mathematically, to the one pattern of fault motion that could have produced that particular spray of signals. That calculation is the moment tensor, and out of it falls the geometry, the strike, the dip, and the all-important rake. There is one beautiful, frustrating catch built into this method, and you deserve to know about it. The mathematics does not hand you a single fault plane, it hands you two. For any earthquake, the wave pattern turns out to be equally consistent with the fault being either of two planes set at right angles to each other, and from the seismic data alone you genuinely cannot tell which of the two actually slipped. That is why the solution for Palu listed two planes, one with a strike of about 284 degrees and one at about 106 degrees. One of them is the real fault. The other is its mathematical twin, what scientists call the auxiliary plane. To decide which is which, they lean on other clues, the alignment of the aftershocks, the known geology, the faults already mapped in the area. But here is the reassuring part for our purposes. Both planes in the Palu solution described the same style of motion. Both carried rake values near -90. So no matter which plane was the true fault, the answer to the question that actually matters, what kind of earthquake was this, came back identical. It was normal faulting either way. The crust dropped either way. That is exactly why reading the rake is like reading a fingerprint left at a scene. It does not care about our expectations. It does not care that this place is famous for tearing sideways. It simply records what truly happened, encoded in the geometry of the waves, and what it recorded for June 15th was extension, a block falling into a widening gap, a mechanism pointedly unlike the catastrophe that made this ground infamous. The fingerprint did not match the old crime. It belonged to something new, and the instruments were certain of it. How shallow was this earthquake, and why do a few miles of rock make all the difference between a scare and a disaster? Let me show you. Part 3. 6 miles down. Depth is the quiet variable that decides whether an earthquake is a story or a tragedy. Two earthquakes can share the exact same magnitude, the exact same release of energy, and yet one of them barely rattles the teacups while the other flattens a town, and the difference between them is often nothing more than how far below the surface the rupture happened. The Palu earthquake of June 15th was very, very close to the surface, and that single fact is what took a magnitude in the high sixes and gave it teeth. The numbers told the story. The hypercenter, the actual point underground where the rock failed, was placed at roughly 10 to 11.5 kilometers down, which is about 6 miles. In the world of earthquakes, that is shallow, and shallow is dangerous. To understand why, you have to think about what the energy of an earthquake actually has to do to reach you. When a rupture happens far below, say 60 or 70 miles down, all of that energy has to claw its way up through dozens of miles of rock before it ever reaches a human being, and along the way the rock soaks up much of the punch, spreading it out, softening it, turning a sharp blow into a long rolling sway. But when the rupture happens only 6 miles down, there is almost nothing between the violence and the surface. The energy arrives barely diluted. It arrives as a slam. That is why a shallow 6.7 can feel like something far larger to the people standing above it. The crust did not have the chance to absorb the blow. It delivered it almost whole, straight up into the foundations of homes and shops and offices, and the result was exactly what you would expect when the planet hits that hard from that close. Reports coming out of the region in the first hours described residents fleeing their homes, their offices, their shopping areas, pouring out into the open the way people do when instinct overrides everything else. The shaking, by several accounts, lasted more than a minute in some locations, and if you have never felt the ground move for a full minute, let me tell you, a minute is an eternity. A few seconds of shaking is frightening. A minute is the kind of duration where people stop assuming it will end and start wondering if it ever will. Remember, this is the same ground we have been circling this whole time, the haunted zone near Palu, and the way it broke this time tells us something. A shallow rupture, close to the surface, in a place with this history, is precisely the combination that turns a moderate magnitude into a community-wide emergency. The early accounts spoke of cracked ground, of damage to individual houses, of the structural insults you get when the earth jolts hard and fast right beneath a town. What the early accounts did not yet show, and this matters, was confirmation of the kind of widespread total collapse that defined the worst disasters of the past. People were shaken, frightened, and in some cases hurt. Buildings were damaged. But in those first hours there was no confirmed evidence of entire districts coming down. That distinction is going to become important, so file it away. There was one more report, and I want to flag it carefully, because it is exactly the sort of thing that can either be the first hint of a hidden danger or simply a frightened rumour in the fog of a disaster. There was an unconfirmed mention of water receding along the coast, and a suggestion that the quake might have triggered a landslide. I want to be completely honest with you about the status of that claim. It was not confirmed, it was a thread to watch, not a fact to repeat. But the reason it makes people nervous, the reason it is not just idle chatter, is that receding water and triggered landslides near Palu carry a specific and terrible memory, because both of those things were part of how this exact place killed thousands of people the last time. We will get there. For now, hold the picture of what this earthquake was at the surface. A shallow, hard, close jolt that emptied buildings and lasted long enough to terrify in a region already on edge, breaking in a way the experts did not expect. By the cold arithmetic of seismology, it was a major earthquake but not a catastrophic one, at least not in those first hours. No great tsunami had been reported. No tsunami warning was raised. As a rough rule, you generally need a larger quake, often up in the mid-sevens or higher, and the right kind of motion, before the ocean itself rises up as a weapon. By that rule, a shallow 6.7 that dropped the crust rather than thrusting the seafloor should not, on its own, send a wall of water at anyone. And yet the unease did not lift, and here is why. And this is the thread that ties this whole story together. The danger of this earthquake was never really about the damage it did on June 15th. The damage, as serious as it was for the people who felt it, was survivable, localized, the kind of event a region recovers from. The danger is about what this earthquake might be a sign of. It is about the place it chose. It is about the strange new way it broke. And it is about the fact that the last time this ground let go, it did something that the science of the day believed was nearly impossible, something that rewrote the textbooks and left a warning hanging over not just Indonesia, but fault zones all around the world. To understand why a shallow 6.7 near Palu makes seismologists brace rather than relax, you have to leave June 15th, 2026 for a little while. You have to walk backward in time into the worst day this stretch of coast has ever recorded, and stand inside the disaster that made the name Palu synonymous with a very particular kind of nightmare. Because once you have seen what this ground is capable of, the quiet 6.7 that just struck it stops looking like an ending. It starts looking like a question. To really feel why depth matters this much, it helps to separate two ideas that people constantly confuse: magnitude and intensity. Magnitude is a single number describing the total energy the earthquake released at its source, the size of the event itself. Intensity is something else entirely. Intensity is how strongly the ground actually shook at a particular spot on the surface, how violently it was felt where you happened to be standing. One earthquake has one magnitude, but it has many intensities, fierce near the rupture and fading with distance, and the dial that turns a given magnitude into a given intensity right above the fault is depth. A shallow rupture delivers a far higher intensity at the surface than a far down one of the same magnitude, because the energy has so little room to spread and weaken before it arrives. The Palu earthquake, shallow as it was, converted its high sixes magnitude into a savage local intensity, and that is the number the people actually felt. Two more things sharpen that local blow into real damage, and they are the soil and the structures. When the energy reaches the surface, soft, loose, water-laden ground can shake far more violently than solid bedrock, amplifying the motion like a bowl of gelatin trembling on a table. And the buildings standing on that ground matter enormously. In many parts of this region, homes and shops were never engineered to survive a hard, fast jolt, and so a shaking that a well-built structure might shrug off can crack and break a vulnerable one. This is why one and the same earthquake can be a footnote in one country and a catastrophe in another. The magnitude is identical. The ground and the buildings are not. And then there is the plain human dimension of duration. The report said the shaking lasted more than a minute in some places, and I want you to sit with what that means for a human body and a human mind. A few seconds of shaking triggers alarm, but you can hold yourself together, because some part of you trusts it will stop. A full minute is another thing entirely. A minute is long enough for the alarm to curdle into real terror, long enough to stop believing it will ever end, long enough to send a sane person sprinting into the open street rather than waiting it out, which is exactly what people did. The body does not experience a minute of violent shaking as a measurement. It experiences it as forever. All of which is why I keep circling back to the same uneasy point. In those first hours, there was no confirmation of the widespread total collapse that defines the worst disasters, and that is genuinely good news. But early reports are fragile things, assembled in chaos, and the absence of confirmed catastrophe is not the same as the confirmation of safety. The honest stance is to hold the good news lightly, because the place this happened has before turned a similar jolt into something unspeakably worse. What happened here the last time the Earth came apart? Let me take you back. Part 4. The Day Palu Drowned. In September of 2018, the ground beneath Central Sulawesi tore open, and a city died in pieces. I want to walk you through that day, not to dwell on horror for its own sake, but because you cannot understand the fear that a new earthquake brings to this place until you understand what the last one did. The event that struck near Palu years ago was a magnitude 7.5, and on paper, that is only a bit larger than the 6.7 we just witnessed. But the 7.5 did not just shake Palu, it unmade it, and it did so through not one mechanism of death, but three, layered on top of each other in a single afternoon. The first was the shaking itself. The rupture ran along the major fault that threads right through this region, a long, well-known fracture in the crust, and it was shallow, and it was violent. Buildings that were never engineered for that kind of assault folded. But the shaking, as brutal as it was only the opening act, because the rupture set in motion two far stranger and far more lethal processes, and the first of them came from the sea. A tsunami rose inside the bay at Palu. Now, you have to picture the geography to understand why this was so cruel. Palu sits at the inland end of a long, narrow bay, a funnel of water reaching in from the ocean, with the city sitting at the far closed end. When the earthquake struck, the water in that bay was set violently in motion, and as it raced toward the narrow, shallow, closed end where the people lived, the funnel did what funnels do. It squeezed the wave higher. The water reared up and slammed into the waterfront with a speed and a height that left almost no time to run. People on the beach, people at a festival being held along the shore that very evening, were caught in the open. The bay had turned the ocean into a weapon and aimed it directly at the city. And here is the part that genuinely unsettled scientists, the part you need to carry forward with you, because it connects straight back to the earthquake we're tracking tonight. The kind of fault that ruptured in 2018 was mainly a sideways fault, a strike-slip fault, the rock grinding past itself horizontally. And sideways faults are not supposed to be efficient tsunami makers. The classic tsunami, the ocean-wide monster, usually comes from a different kind of quake, the type where a chunk of seafloor is thrust suddenly upward, heaving the entire water column above it. A sideways tear should mostly move the ground side to side, not up and down, and side to side does not lift the sea. Yet Palu got a deadly tsunami anyway. The water came, and it came from a fault that, by the textbook, should not have produced one. How? The most likely answer is a combination of things, and every one of them is a warning. Part of it was probably the way the seafloor in the bay did shift vertically in places, even on a sideways fault, because the real geometry of these ruptures is messy. Part of it, and possibly the larger part, was underwater landslides. The violent shaking knocked loose great masses of sediment along the steep underwater walls of the bay, and those submarine collapses shoved the water aside and helped raise the wave. And part of it was simply the shape of the bay, that long narrow funnel amplifying whatever motion reached it. Put those together and you get a tsunami from a fault that should not make tsunamis, in a place perfectly shaped to magnify it. But the sea was not even the strangest killer that day. The strangest, and for many the most horrifying, was what the land itself did. In several neighbourhoods around Palu, the ground turned to liquid. The phenomenon is called liquefaction, and it happens when violent shaking hits the wrong kind of soil, a loose, water-saturated soil, and momentarily transforms it from solid ground into something with the consistency of a thick fluid. For a few terrible minutes, the earth in those districts stopped behaving like earth. Whole neighbourhoods, places with names like Potobo and Balaroa, did not just collapse, they flowed. The ground carried houses hundreds of feet from where they had stood, churning them together, swallowing some structures entirely and rafting others across the liquefied surface like boats on a current that should never have existed. When the shaking stopped and the soil solidified again, it locked everything in place, burying what it had taken. When the counting was finally done, the dead and the missing numbered in the thousands. The figure most often cited is over 2,000 lost, and broader estimates that include the missing climb higher still. An entire city had been attacked from 3 directions at once, by the shaking, by the sea, and by the ground beneath its own feet, and it had nowhere to run because every direction was its own kind of trap. Now you understand the name. Now you understand why, when a fresh earthquake lights up the instruments right next to Palu, the people who know this history do not exhale, they tense. Because this is not a region with a theoretical hazard, a danger that lives only in models and probabilities. This is a region that has already shown the entire world exactly what it can do, in living memory, with a death toll that runs into the thousands. And the earthquake we're following tonight, the shallow 6.7 of June 15th, struck the same haunted zone, only a few miles from where all of that happened. But remember the mismatch. Remember the beach ball. The 2018 catastrophe was a sideways tear. The new earthquake was a downward drop, a normal faulting event, a different mechanism entirely. So is that good news? A sign that this was not a repeat of the killer rupture? Or is it something more troubling, evidence that this tangled, lethal zone has more than one way to come apart, and that we have only seen some of them? To answer that, we have to understand the most astonishing thing scientists discovered about the 2018 earthquake, a discovery that came only later and that turned Palu from a tragedy into a global warning. It is worth slowing down on how that day actually unfolded, because the sequence itself carries a lesson for the night of June 15th. The great rupture of 2018 did not arrive entirely without preamble. A smaller, strong earthquake struck the same region first, hours before, the kind of event that on its own would have made the news and then faded from memory. People felt it, absorbed it, and went on with their evening, with no way of knowing it was a prelude. Then the main shock, the magnitude 7.5, tore along the fault, and everything changed in a heartbeat. That ordering, a strong quake followed by a far larger one, is precisely the foreshock scenario that shadows the analysis of any new earthquake in this zone, and it is one of the reasons a fresh 6.7 here cannot simply be filed away as the end of the story. Along the waterfront that evening, the timing was unbearably cruel. A festival was being prepared on the shore of Palu Bay, drawing crowds down to the very edge of the water, to the one place that would prove most lethal in the minutes that followed. When the wave rose in the bay and raced toward the closed inland end, it gave the people gathered there almost no time. A tsunami in a confined bay does not always announce itself with a long, slow withdrawal, the way an open coast wave sometimes does. It can arrive in minutes, or less, and the funnel only makes it faster and taller. Those few minutes were the entire margin between life and death, and for far too many there was no margin at all. The liquefaction, meanwhile, deserves a closer look, because it is so counterintuitive that many people refuse to believe it until they see the footage. Solid ground does not merely shake in a quake, it can momentarily stop being solid at all. In soils that are loose, sandy, and saturated with water, the violent shaking forces the water trapped between the grains into higher and higher pressure, until the grains lose contact with one another and the whole mass briefly behaves like a heavy liquid. For those few minutes, the ground has the strength of mud. Anything resting on it, a house, a road, a person, can sink, tilt, or be carried along as the liquefied layer flows downhill. Then, the shaking stops. The water pressure bleeds away, the grains settle back into contact, and the ground freezes solid again, locking everything it moved into its new and terrible position. Put those three killers together, the shaking, the bay-amplified wave, and the flowing ground, and you understand why Palu did not just become a disaster, but became one of the most intensely studied earthquakes in modern science. Researchers descended on it precisely because it broke so many rules at once, and in studying why, they uncovered the single most alarming fact of all, the discovery that turned this local tragedy into a warning for fault zones everywhere. What did the ground in Palu do that scientists once believed was nearly impossible? That is where we go next. Part 5. Breaking the speed limit. For a long time, scientists believed earthquakes had a speed limit. Not a limit on how big they could be, but a limit on how fast the rupture itself could race along the fault, and the 2018 Palu earthquake broke it. To understand why that single fact sent a chill through the entire field of seismology, and why it hangs over the new earthquake we're tracking tonight, you first have to understand what is actually moving when a fault breaks. When an earthquake happens, the fault does not snap all at once, like breaking a pencil. Instead, the rupture tears along the fault, starting at one point and ripping outward, like a zipper coming undone at tremendous speed. As that tear races along, it radiates energy in the form of seismic waves, and there are different kinds of those waves travelling at different speeds. There are faster waves and slower waves, and one particular type, called the shear wave, normally sets the pace. Under almost all circumstances, the tear in the fault travels slower than its own shear waves. The waves outrun the rupture. That is the ordinary order of things, the expected arrangement, the speed limit. Palu shattered that order. In 2018, the rupture tore along the fault faster than its own shear waves could travel. The tear outran the very waves it was producing. Scientists call this a super shear earthquake, and it is the seismic equivalent of an aircraft breaking the sound barrier. When a jet flies faster than sound, the sound waves it generates cannot get out of the way in time, so they pile up into a single shock front and we hear it as a sonic boom. A super shear earthquake does something hauntingly similar. The rupture outruns its own waves, and the energy stacks up in front of the tear into a concentrated shock front, focusing the shaking, intensifying it, hammering the ground harder and faster than a normal rupture ever could. Palu was, in effect, a sonic boom travelling through solid rock, and the people above it were standing on the runway. This is the headline that went around the world afterward. The reporting put it plainly that the Indonesian earthquake had broken a geologic speed limit, that a super shear earthquake on a common kind of fault could raise hazard estimates, and that phrase, a common kind of fault, is the quiet horror buried in the discovery, the part that turns a single Indonesian tragedy into a warning for the entire planet. Let me explain why. Before Palu, many researchers thought that super shear ruptures were rare, and that when they did happen, they needed very special conditions. They thought you needed a long, straight, simple, clean fault for the rupture to build up that kind of speed, a smooth track with no obstacles. Palu was not that. The fault that ruptured in 2018 had bends in it. It had complexity. It had segments and kinks and irregularities, the kind of messy geometry that should have slowed the rupture down, that should have prevented it from ever reaching super shear speed. And yet it got there anyway. The earthquake reached that extreme velocity despite running along a complicated, imperfect fault, and that is exactly what frightened the scientists. Because if a complex, bent, segmented fault like the one under Palu can still produce a supershear rupture, then supershear may be far more common and far more possible on far more faults than anyone had assumed. The neat rule, the comforting idea that only rare, perfect faults could do this, fell apart. And that opened a profoundly uncomfortable question about other complex strike-slip faults all over the world. Faults that are bent and segmented and messy. Faults that run beneath cities. Faults, to name the one everyone immediately thinks of, like the San Andreas in California, which is itself a long, complicated strike-slip system threading directly past millions of people. In 2019, that warning was made explicit in the scientific literature. The researchers studying Palu raised the alarm that the hazard of this whole class of faults might be underestimated, precisely because the assumption about what was needed for supershear had just been proven wrong in the field. And I want you to notice something about that warning, because it matters for the conspiracy-minded corner of this story that we will reach later. The warning was not hidden. It was not suppressed. It was published openly, reported widely, sitting in the scientific record for anyone to read. Science did warn about this place and about places like it. The warning simply does not work the way people wish it did, because a warning about long-term hazard is not the same as a prediction that a specific quake will strike on a specific night. So now bring it all the way back to June 15th, 2026, and you can feel the weight settle into place. The fault system near Palu has already demonstrated in living memory that it can do one of the most violent things an earthquake is capable of. It can rupture at supershear speed. It can break a limit that scientists once thought was nearly unbreakable. That capability did not vanish after 2018. It is still latent in the system, still part of what this ground can do, and now a fresh earthquake has struck right next to it. The new quake, the shallow 6.7, was not itself a supershear monster. It was, by its mechanism, a different and in some ways quieter kind of failure, a downward drop rather than a record-breaking sideways tear. But it landed on a system that has shown, beyond any doubt, what it is capable of at its worst, and that is the real reason the experts did not relax when they saw a merely major earthquake instead of a catastrophic one. They were not asking whether this particular quake was the disaster. They were asking what this particular quake might be doing to a system that has a proven, documented world record capacity for catastrophe. To ask that question properly, we have to look at the fault itself, the actual structure in the crust that runs beneath this region, and understand why it is built in a way that lets it break sideways in one place and drop straight down a few miles away. Because the architecture of this fault is the reason the new earthquake is so hard to read. How do you even prove that a rupture outran its own waves, when the whole thing is buried miles underground and over in less than a minute? This is where modern science gets to flex, because the evidence came from several independent directions at once, and they all pointed the same way. From orbit, satellites that map the ground surface with radar and with high-resolution imagery captured the before and the after, letting researchers measure exactly how far and in what direction the land had shifted along the fault. Ground-based instruments that track position with great precision recorded the permanent offsets, and by carefully timing when the seismic energy arrived at stations around the world, scientists could reconstruct, almost frame by frame, how fast the rupture had torn along the fault. When they ran the numbers, the rupture front had been moving faster than the shear waves it was generating. The conclusion was not a guess. It was a measurement, confirmed from space and from the ground and from the seismic record together. Picture what that actually looks like in the rock, because the image is the whole point. In an ordinary earthquake, the rupture tears along behind its own waves, and the shaking radiates outward more or less evenly, the way ripples spread from a stone dropped in a pond. In a supershear earthquake, the rupture catches up to and passes its own shear waves, and the energy can no longer spread out ahead of it. Instead, it piles into a concentrated cone of shaking that travels with the rupture front, the seismic version of the cone of sound that trails a supersonic jet. The ground in the path of that cone does not get the gentle spreading ripple. It gets the stacked, focused shock hitting harder and faster than the magnitude alone would predict. That is why super shear earthquakes punch above their weight, and why the people of Palu were hammered the way they were. For a long time, only a small handful of earthquakes anywhere in the world had been suspected of doing this, and every one of them had run along long, straight, simple stretches of fault, which seemed to confirm the comforting rule that you needed a smooth, clean track to reach such speeds. Palu broke that confidence apart because the fault it ran along was anything but smooth. It bent, it stepped, it was segmented and irregular, exactly the kind of geometry that should have tripped the rupture, slowed it, stopped it from ever reaching super sheer speed. And yet, it got there. That is the detail that turned a regional tragedy into a global problem, because it meant the rule was wrong, and that the messy, complicated faults running beneath so many of the world's cities might be capable of far more than anyone had credited them with. And the fault beneath Palu is one of those messy, complicated systems, which is exactly why we now have to look at its architecture directly. Because the same complexity that let it reach record speed in 2018 is the complexity that made the new earthquake break in such a different way. And to understand that, you have to see how this fault is actually built. What exactly is the fault beneath Palu, and why is it shaped like a trap? Let me show you the machine. Part 6. Indonesia's San Andreas. If you want to understand the earthquake of June 15th, you have to meet the fault that produced it, and the fault that produced it has a name and a personality. It is called the Palu Koro Fault, and it is one of the fastest moving, most dangerous strike-slip faults on the entire planet. I called the San Andreas to mind a moment ago, and that was not a throwaway comparison. The Palu Koro is, in a real sense, Indonesia's San Andreas, a major sideways grinding fracture in the crust, and in some respects it is moving even faster than its famous Californian cousin. Let me explain what a strike-slip fault is, in plain terms, because it is the foundation of everything. A strike-slip fault is a place where two blocks of the Earth's crust are sliding horizontally past each other. Imagine two enormous slabs grinding side by side in opposite directions, locked together by friction for years or centuries, slowly building up strain until the friction finally loses and they lurch past each other in a sudden violent jump. That jump is the earthquake. The San Andreas works this way, the Palu Koro works this way, and the Palu Koro does it quickly, with the two sides accumulating strain at a rate often estimated in the range of 30 to 40 millimeters a year, which in the unhurried world of plate tectonics is a sprint. Fast-loading faults reload their stress faster, and faults that reload faster can rupture more often. This is not a sleepy structure. It is a fast, active, heavily loaded fault threading right through where people live. But here is where the Palu Koro stops being a simple sideways fault and becomes the tangle I keep warning you about, the trap that makes the new earthquake so hard to read. The fault does not run as one clean straight line. Near Palu it bends and pulls apart, and in the gap created by that bending, the crust is actually being stretched. There is a name for this kind of structure. It is called a pull-apart basin, and Palu Bay, that long narrow funnel that channeled the killer tsunami in 2018, is itself a pull-apart basin, a depression in the crust created precisely because the sideways fault has a step in it that is dragging the ground apart. Think about what that means. Along most of its length, the Palu Koro is a sideways fault, pure strike slip, the kind of motion that tore the city open years ago. But right at Palu, where the fault steps and bends, the crust is being pulled apart, stretched, placed under tension. And tension, as we learned from reading that beach ball, is exactly what produces normal faulting. The downward drop, the block falling into the widening gap. Suddenly the mismatch we have been puzzling over makes complete sense. The new earthquake was a normal faulting event because it ruptured on one of the normal faults embedded inside the pull-apart, the stretched zone, rather than on the main sideways strand. It was not the wrong kind of earthquake for this place at all. It was the signature of the stretching part of a system that does both at once. Scientists have a word for a system that combines sideways shearing and crustal stretching in the same place, and the word is transtension. Transtension means transition plus tension, shear plus pull apart, happening together, and it perfectly describes the ground beneath Palu. This is a place where the crust is being sheared sideways and stretched open at the same time, and that combination is exactly why the region can break in such different ways. The main strands grind sideways and can produce a super shear monster. The pull-apart faults drop and produce the kind of normal faulting quake we just saw. They are two faces of one tangled, restless machine, and they share the same forces, the same plate collision driving all of it. This is the part that should reframe how you see the entire night of June 15th. The new earthquake was not an event happening near the dangerous fault. It was an event happening on a piece of the dangerous fault, a different piece, breaking in a different way but plugged into the same system that killed thousands before. When one part of a tangled machine like this moves, it changes the loads on the other parts. Stress that was sitting on the strand that dropped does not simply vanish. It gets passed along, redistributed, pushed onto neighbouring segments, including potentially the main sideways strands that have the proven capacity for catastrophe. I do not want to overstate this because honesty is the whole point of how we do things here. A single normal faulting 6.7 does not mean the main Palu Koro strand is now primed to unleash another great rupture tomorrow. The relationship between one earthquake and the next is genuinely uncertain, and we will spend real time on that uncertainty because it is where the careful science lives. But I also will not understate it, because the structure is what it is. This was a strong, shallow earthquake on a fast, dangerous transtensional fault system, in the exact place where that system has already demonstrated, with thousands of deaths, what it is capable of at its worst. Those are not opinions, those are the facts of the machine. And the machine has one more terrible trick that we have not fully unpacked, a trick that the 2018 disaster revealed and that the new earthquake quietly keeps alive. It is the reason that even a shallow quake on this coast, even one that does not seem big enough to raise the ocean, cannot be fully cleared of the worst danger this place carries. It has to do with how a sideways fault, a fault that should not make a tsunami, managed to drown a city anyway, and why that pathway has not closed. To understand why the Palu Koro is so complicated, you have to understand the island it runs through, because Sulawesi is one of the strangest and most tectonically tortured pieces of land on Earth. Look at a map of it, and you will see an island shaped almost like a letter K, or a sprawling spider, with long arms splaying out in different directions. That bizarre shape is not an accident. It is the surface expression of a slow-motion collision, involving several different plates and crustal blocks, all crowding into the same small region and grinding against one another. The Great Plates of the area, the Sunda Block to the west, the Australian Plate pushing up from the south, the Philippine Sea and Pacific influences from the east, all converge near here, and caught in the middle are smaller blocks of crust being squeezed, rotated and sheared. Sulawesi is, in effect, a tectonic traffic accident frozen into geography. The Palu Koro Fault is one of the main structures accommodating all that chaos. As the blocks of crust rotate and slide past one another, the strain has to be taken up somewhere, and a great deal of it is taken up along this fault, which is part of why it moves so quickly. When I told you it loads strain at something like 30 to 40 millimeters a year, compare that to the more famous San Andreas, which moves at a broadly similar but in places somewhat slower rate. The Palu Koro is keeping pace with one of the most notorious faults on the planet, and in some stretches outrunning it, draining the motion of a whole tangle of colliding blocks through one fast, dangerous seam in the crust. And because that motion is not perfectly straight, because the blocks are rotating rather than simply sliding past in a clean line, the fault is forced to bend and step to accommodate them. Where it bends one way, the crust gets squeezed and pushed up. Where it bends the other way, the crust gets pulled apart and dropped, creating the pull-apart basins, including the one that cradles Palu Bay. So the very same regional forces that make this fault fast and dangerous also make it geometrically messy, threaded with sideways strands and stretching zones and compressional knots, all active, all sharing the load. It is not one fault with one behaviour. It is a system, and a system can surprise you. This is the architecture that the new earthquake plugged into, and it reframes everything. The June 15th quake was a normal faulting drop on a stretching segment of a fast, rotating, tangled system that also contains the sideways strands capable of super shear catastrophe. Those strands are not separate faults in a separate place. They are parts of the same machine, sharing the same drive, and when one part moves, the loads on the others shift. That is the structural reason a single moderate quake here is worth watching so closely, and it leads straight to the most unsettling capability this system still holds. Why can this fault still threaten the sea even when the rules say it should not? That is the next piece of the puzzle. Part 7. A tsunami from a fault that shouldn't make one. The most dangerous assumption you can make about the ground beneath Palu is that a sideways fault cannot drown you. The textbook says it should not. The 2018 disaster proved the textbook wrong, and the way it proved the textbook wrong is the reason that even the quiet 6.7 of June 15th cannot be fully cleared of the worst fear this coast carries. Let me walk you through the mechanism, because it is one of the most important and least understood pieces of this entire story. Start with the rule, so you can appreciate how it broke. The ocean-spanning tsunamis that haunt the imagination, the ones that have killed hundreds of thousands in our lifetimes, almost always come from a particular kind of earthquake, the type where the seafloor is shoved suddenly and sharply upward. When a slab of ocean floor heaves up, it lifts the entire column of water sitting on top of it, and that lifted water has to go somewhere, so it spreads outward as a tsunami. That vertical heave is the engine. A sideways strike-slip fault, by contrast, mostly moves the ground horizontally, side to side, and side-to-side motion does not lift the sea. So in theory, a strike-slip fault should be a poor tsunami maker, and Palu Koro is a strike-slip system. By the rule, the people of Palu should have been spared the water. They were not spared the water. The tsunami came, and it came hard, and reconstructing how it did so revealed that a strike-slip coast can be far more dangerous than the simple rule suggests. There were probably three things working together, and each one remains in play today. The first is that real ruptures are messy, and even a mostly sideways fault can produce patches of genuine vertical motion of the seafloor, especially where the fault bends and steps, which near Palu it does constantly. Some of the wave was likely born from those vertical jogs in a fault that was supposed to move flat. The second mechanism is the one that should make you think hard about that unconfirmed report of receding water and a possible landslide from June 15th. The second mechanism was submarine landslides. The violent shaking shook loose enormous masses of loose sediment piled along the steep underwater walls of Palu Bay, and when those underwater slopes collapsed, they shoved the water aside, displacing it, heaving it into a wave. An underwater landslide can raise a tsunami all on its own, no seafloor thrust required, and the bay around Palu is lined with exactly the kind of steep, sediment-loaded underwater slopes that fail when the ground shakes. So when I told you earlier that a witness mentioned receding water and a possible landslide, and that the claim was unconfirmed but worth watching, this is why it is worth watching. Those are the precise ingredients that turned a sideways fault into a killer of thousands the last time, and a report of them recurring, even an unverified one, is not something a careful observer dismisses out of hand. The third mechanism was the shape of the bay itself, that long, narrow closing funnel with the city at its end. Whatever wave was generated by the vertical jogs or the landslides or both was then channeled and squeezed and amplified by the geometry of the bay as it raced toward the people. The funnel took whatever the earthquake gave it and made it taller and meaner by the time it arrived. And that funnel has not changed. The bay is still shaped exactly the way it was. The steep underwater slopes are still loaded with sediment. The fault still bends and steps beneath the water. Every ingredient that produced the 2018 tsunami is still present, still arranged, still waiting. This is why the new earthquake, even as a shallow normal faulting 6.7 that triggered no warning and raised no great wave, cannot be filed away as harmless. The fact that this particular quake did not generate a significant tsunami is genuinely good news for June 15th. But the pathway, the mechanism, the terrible combination of landslide-prone underwater slopes and an amplifying funnel and a fault that can jog vertically, all of that is intact. A shallow earthquake close to that bay keeps the possibility alive in a way that a quake in open ocean never would. The danger is not that this 6.7 made a tsunami. It is that this 6.7 is a reminder that the machine capable of making one is still loaded, still active, and just moved again. And that brings us back every single time to the central worry that runs through this whole story. The earthquake of June 15th was not, in itself, the catastrophe. The shaking was survivable. The tsunami did not come. The collapse was not, in those first hours, total. But the event struck a system with a documented capacity for super shear rupture, for liquefaction that swallows neighbourhoods, and for tsunamis born from landslides in an amplifying bay. It is a warning shot on a coast that has already shown it can deliver the real thing. So the question that should be burning in your mind by now is not how bad was this quake. The question is, what is this quake connected to, and is it part of something larger? Because the Palu earthquake did not happen in isolation. It happened in the middle of one of the most seismically violent stretches the wider region has seen in a long while, with a genuine giant having struck only days before, and a scatter of strong quakes rattling through the neighbourhood. And the moment you put the new earthquake into that context, a genuinely unsettling question rises up. The same question the experts were quietly asking. Is all of this connected? There is a reason submarine landslides are such a feared and underappreciated source of tsunamis, and it is worth making explicit, because it bears directly on the danger that lingers around Palu. A tsunami born from a seafloor thrust, the classic kind, usually gives a coastline at least some warning, because the earthquake is detected, its size is estimated, and warning centres can issue alerts before the waves arrive from across the ocean. A tsunami born from an underwater landslide is a different and crueler animal. The landslide is often triggered right next to the coast it threatens, so the wave has almost no distance to travel and almost no time to be detected before it strikes. By the time anyone understands what has happened, the water is already there. Landslide tsunamis are local, fast, and nearly impossible to warn against, and that is precisely the kind of tsunami that helped kill so many at Palu. It gets worse when you consider how tsunami warning systems are actually designed, because they are built mainly around the classic source, the large undersea thrust. The systems watch for big earthquakes of the type that lift the seafloor, estimate the threat from the magnitude and location, and issue warnings accordingly. A shallow strike-slip earthquake, the kind that is not supposed to make a tsunami, may not trip the same alarms, even though, as Palu proved, it can still spawn a deadly local wave through landslides and the quirks of bay geometry. So you have a hazard that the warning systems are not optimized to catch, hitting a coastline shaped to amplify whatever wave it produces. That combination is close to a worst case, and it is built into the geography around Palu. This is why I treated that single unconfirmed report of receding water and a possible landslide on June 15th with such care rather than waving it away. In most places, a stray mention like that would be background noise. Around Palu, it touches the exact mechanism that turned a sideways fault into a mass killer, in a bay perfectly shaped to magnify it, against which the warning systems offer the least protection. The June 15th quake did not, in the end, produce a significant tsunami, and that is real good news. But the reason careful people did not simply exhale is that every ingredient of the 2018 disaster is still in place, still loaded, and the new earthquake was a reminder of how little warning this coast would get if those ingredients ever combined again. So the local danger is clear, and the historical danger is clear. What remained, on the night of June 15th, was the question of the regional danger, the unsettling possibility that this earthquake was not alone at all. Were these earthquakes talking to each other across hundreds of miles? Let me show you what was happening around Palu in the days before it broke. Part 8. 1 week, 3 quakes, 3 faults. To feel why the Palu earthquake landed with such unease, you have to zoom out from that one dot on the map and look at the whole neighbourhood, because the whole neighbourhood had been coming apart for days. This corner of the world, where the southern Philippines and eastern Indonesia crowd together along the western rim of the Pacific, is one of the most tectonically violent regions on Earth, a place where several of the planet's restless plates jostle and collide and dive beneath one another, and in the span of about a week it produced a sequence of earthquakes that, taken together, looked less like random noise and more like a region in revolt. It began with a genuine monster. Just days before Palu, a magnitude 7.8 earthquake struck off the southern Philippines, in the waters near Mindanao, on a feature called the Cotabato Trench. If you have been following this channel, you already know about that one, because we covered it when it happened, and we said at the time that the danger was not just the quake itself, but what the region might do next. A 7.8 is not in the same league as a 6.7. The magnitude scale is deceptive that way, because each step up represents a massive jump in actual energy released, and a 7.8 unleashes something like dozens of times more energy than a 6.7. That earthquake was the heavyweight of the sequence, a true megathrust-style event on a fast-converging plate boundary, and it rattled the entire region, sending its waves sweeping out across Indonesia and beyond. After the 7.8 came the aftershocks and the companions. There was a magnitude 6.2 reported in the early hours, occurring in a completely different trough zone from the giant, over on a feature called the Philippine Trench, far down in the subduction zone, around 69 miles below the surface. There were other strong events scattered through, quakes in the low 6s and the mid 5s, and there was a clear sense of activity migrating, spreading southward, the earthquakes marching down the map away from where the big one had struck. To the people watching the seismic feeds closely, the pattern was obvious and ominous. The region was not settling down after the 7.8. It was staying lit. It was, if anything, spreading. And then, into the middle of that restless spreading sequence, the ground near Palu dropped, and the 6.7 we have been tracking all night joined the chorus. So now look at what we actually have. Within roughly a week, across this one corner of the planet, there was a 7.8 on the Cotabato Trench, a 6.2 far below the surface on the Philippine Trench, a scatter of strong quakes in between, and now a shallow 6.7 on the Palu Coro system in Central Sulawesi. 3 major events, and here is the crucial part, on 3 different fault systems. The Cotabato Trench, the Philippine Trench, and the Palu Coro fault are not the same structure. They are separate machines, separate fractures in the crust, hundreds of miles apart in places, each with its own geometry and its own behaviour. That is what makes the question so irresistible and so important to answer carefully. When you see 3 major earthquakes on 3 different faults in 1 week in one region, your brain does what brains are built to do. It looks for the connection. It refuses to believe in coincidence. It wants a single cause, a hidden hand, something tying it all together, because a world where these events are linked feels more understandable, and frankly more controllable, than a world where the ground just happens to be breaking in several places at once. And the most natural version of that question, the one people immediately asked, was this. Did the 7.8 cause the others? Did the giant earthquake off Mindanao reach across hundreds of miles and set off the quake near Palu? It is a fair question, and it deserves a real answer rather than a dismissive one, because the honest answer has 2 halves, and both halves matter. The first half is a clear no. The Palu earthquake is not a direct aftershock of the 7.8. The 2 events are on entirely different fault systems, separated by a great distance, and the Philippine earthquake did not break the Palu fault. When seismologists talk about aftershocks in the strict sense, they mean the swarm of smaller quakes that follow a big one on, or very near the same fault that ruptured, as the crust around the rupture readjusts. By that definition, what happened near Palu was not an aftershock of the Mindanao quake at all. Different fault, different system, not the same rupture readjusting. But the second half of the answer is where it gets genuinely interesting, and where you have to resist the urge to slam the door too quickly. Because while the 7.8 did not directly break the Palu fault, a giant earthquake like that does send powerful seismic waves rippling through the entire region, and there is a real, documented phenomenon by which those passing waves can nudge other faults. Faults that were already sitting right on the edge of failure into letting go. It is not magic, and it is not a hidden hand. It is physics, and it has a name, and understanding it is the key to holding both halves of the answer at once, the no and the maybe, without collapsing into either a flat denial or a wild conspiracy. I want to make sure the scale of these numbers is clear, because the magnitude scale is one of the most misleading things in all of science for ordinary people, and misreading it leads to badly wrong intuitions about this sequence. The scale is not linear. It is logarithmic, which means each whole step up represents a roughly 10-fold jump in the size of the shaking, and something like a 32-fold jump in the actual energy released. So a magnitude 7.8 is not a little bigger than a 6.7. It is in a different universe. The energy gap between them is enormous, the 7.8 unleashing on the order of dozens of times more energy than the 6.7. When you hear that the region produced a 7.8 and then a 6.7, your instinct might be to file them as comparable events, 2 big quakes. They are not comparable. One was a giant. The other, serious as it is a fraction of its power. Holding that scale in mind is essential to thinking clearly about whether and how they could possibly be connected. Now, why does this one corner of the world produce so many large earthquakes in the first place, enough that several can cluster in a single week? The answer is that the boundary between the Philippines and Indonesia is one of the most tectonically crowded places on the entire planet. Most of the world's earthquakes happen along the edges where the Great Plates meet, and here the edges are anything but simple. Several plates and blocks converge in a tangled knot, diving beneath one another along multiple trenches, grinding past one another along multiple faults, all packed into a relatively small region. The Cotabato Trench, the Philippine Trench, the Palu Coro Fault, and more are all part of this crowded boundary zone, each capable of producing major earthquakes on its own. With that many active, independent structures jammed together, the region generates large quakes at a high background rate, and so several of them landing in 1 week on different faults is not necessarily evidence of a shared cause. It can simply be a busy stretch in an inherently busy place. But, and this is the hook that makes the question impossible to dismiss, a busy place full of primed faults is also exactly the kind of place where one earthquake genuinely can influence another. The very crowding that produces independent quakes also means that when a giant ruptures, its waves wash over many other faults that may be sitting close to failure. So the honest answer to whether the regional sequence is connected has to hold two truths at once. Most of it is probably the independent restlessness of a crowded boundary, and some of it, specifically the possibility that the giant nudged a primed neighbour, is a real and serious mechanism worth taking seriously. To sort one from the other, you have to understand the physics of how a distant earthquake can reach out and touch a fault it never directly broke. That phenomenon is called dynamic triggering, and it is one of the most fascinating and misunderstood ideas in all of earthquake science. So how can an earthquake in one place nudge a fault hundreds of miles away without being its direct cause? Let me explain the long-distance nudge. Part 9. The physics of a long-distance nudge. Imagine a fault that has been quietly loading for centuries, slowly building strain, creeping closer and closer to the moment it will finally let go. Imagine it sitting at 99% of the way there, locked, primed, needing only the smallest extra push to break. Now imagine a giant earthquake erupts hundreds of miles away, and its seismic waves come rolling through, shaking that primed fault for a few seconds as they pass. In that moment, the passing waves can supply the final push. The fault that was already on the edge slips, and a new earthquake is born, far from the original, set off not by being directly broken, but by being nudged at exactly the wrong instant. That is dynamic triggering, and it is the careful, physics-based middle ground between dismissing the regional sequence as pure coincidence and inflating it into a grand conspiracy. We have explored this idea on this channel before, when we looked at earthquakes that seem to answer each other across enormous distances, and the principle is the same here, so let me make it concrete. The key phrase is already on the edge. Dynamic triggering does not create stress out of nothing. It does not reach across the planet and load up a relaxed, healthy fault that had centuries left in it. What it can do is cash in stress that was already there, already accumulated, already nearly at the breaking point. The passing waves are not the cause of the strain. They are merely the trigger that releases strain the fault had been storing on its own. The gun was already loaded. The distant earthquake just happened to pull the trigger. This is why the careful wording matters so much, and why I keep insisting on it. It would be wrong to say the magnitude 7.8 off Mindanao caused the Palu earthquake. That framing implies the giant reached out and broke a distant fault that would otherwise have been fine, and that is almost certainly not what happened. But it would also be wrong to insist the two events have absolutely nothing to do with each other, because the physics of dynamic triggering is real and well documented. The honest, defensible statement sits precisely in between. The Philippine earthquake may have shaken a region that was already under stress, and its passing waves could have helped to nudge a fault near Palu that was already close to failure. Could have, not did, not proven, possible. And I want to be scrupulously clear about that uncertainty, because this is exactly the kind of place where careful science and careless speculation part ways. We do not have proof that the 7.8 triggered the 6.7. Dynamic triggering is notoriously hard to demonstrate in any single case, because you can almost never go back and prove that a particular fault would not have broken anyway at that particular time. What scientists can say is that the mechanism exists, that the timing is suggestive, and that a normal fault in the stretched zone near Palu, if it was already loaded toward failure, is exactly the kind of fault that a great regional earthquake could conceivably help tip over. That is the truth, stated honestly, with all its uncertainty intact, and it is far more interesting than either of the lazy alternatives. There is something almost philosophical buried in this, and it connects right back to the tangled machine we explored earlier. The Palu Coro system is fast, heavily loaded, and complex. It is the kind of place where faults are routinely sitting close to their breaking point, because the plates are driving them hard and the strain accumulates quickly. A region like that is, almost by definition, full of faults that are primed, faults that need only a small nudge. So when a giant earthquake sends its waves sweeping through, A region like Central Sulawesi is precisely where you would expect dynamic triggering to be possible, because the faults there are already living on the edge. The region's own restlessness is what makes it susceptible to a long-distance nudge in the first place. But notice what dynamic triggering does and does not tell us about the future, because this is where people often go wrong. Even if the 7.8 did help nudge the Palu fault, that does not mean a cascade is now unstoppable, that one earthquake will inevitably set off the next, and the next, in an accelerating chain that ends in catastrophe. Dynamic triggering is a limited local-to-primed faults phenomenon. It is a nudge to faults already near failure, not a contagion that loads up healthy crust. The waves pass, and they are gone. They do not linger and keep pushing, so the existence of triggering does not license the doomsday vision of a region tearing itself apart in an endless chain reaction. It simply means that, in a primed and restless zone, a big earthquake can occasionally help its neighbours along, one nudge at a time. So where does that leave the central question of this whole story? The question of what the Palu earthquake means for what comes next. It leaves us with the realization that the regional sequence, the 7.8 and the 6s and the new 6.7, is mostly several independent stories on several independent faults, bound together by a shared, restless setting and by the limited genuine physics of dynamic triggering, rather than by any single hidden hand. The pattern your brain wants to see is partly real and partly an illusion, and the skill is in telling which part is which. And yet, even when we have correctly separated the connected from the coincidental, one piece of the puzzle still refuses to settle, one question that the new earthquake forces us to confront directly, and it is the most uncomfortable question in all of seismology. Because there is a possibility we have not yet faced head-on. What if the 6.7 near Palu was not the end of anything? What if it was the beginning? What if it was not an aftershock, and not a triggered side effect, but a foreshock, the first tremor before something larger on its own fault? The reason scientists take dynamic triggering seriously, rather than treating it as speculation, is that they have watched it happen, repeatedly, in cases where the evidence was hard to argue with. The classic examples come from great earthquakes that were followed, within minutes to hours, by little bursts of seismic activity at locations far away, sometimes thousands of miles from the rupture, in places that have no business being part of the same fault system. When a giant earthquake's surface waves, the large rolling waves that travel along the skin of the planet, sweep through a distant geothermal field or volcanic area or primed fault zone, those regions sometimes light up with their own small quakes right as the waves pass through. The timing is the smoking gun. The little quakes switch on exactly when the waves arrive and fade as they move on, which is very hard to explain as coincidence. Notice the pattern in those well-documented cases, because it tells you something important about what dynamic triggering can and cannot do. The triggered events are almost always small, and they happen in places that were already primed, already hot, already close to failure, like geothermal systems full of pressurized fluids or fault zones under heavy strain. The passing waves give a little jostle, and the systems that were ready to go release a flurry of minor energy. What is far rarer, and far more debated among scientists, is whether passing waves can trigger a genuinely large earthquake, the kind that does real damage rather than just a swarm of small ones. The evidence for triggering big quakes at great distance is much thinner and much more contested, and that uncertainty matters enormously for how we read the Palu situation. Because here is the careful application to June 15th. If the magnitude 7.8 off Mindanao did influence the Palu region, the most scientifically defensible version of that influence is modest. Its waves could have helped jostle a fault near Palu that was already primed, already close to its own failure, into letting go a little sooner than it otherwise would have. That is consistent with everything we know about how dynamic triggering behaves. What would be a far bigger and far less supported claim is that the 7.8 somehow reached across hundreds of miles and manufactured the entire 6.7 out of nothing on a fault that was nowhere near ready. The physics does not support that stronger claim, and neither does the honest weight of the evidence. The defensible statement remains the modest one, a possible nudge to a primed fault, not a long-distance act of creation, and proving even the modest version, in this one specific case, may simply be impossible, and I want to be honest about that limit. To prove the 7.8 triggered the 6.7, you would have to show that the Palu fault would not have broken when it did without the giant's waves, and you can never rerun history to check. dynamic triggering in any single instance usually lives in this fog of plausibility rather than proof. The mechanism is real, the timing is suggestive, the certainty is unavailable, and that is the honest place to leave it, which brings us to a far more pointed and personal danger that the new earthquake raises. How do scientists tell the difference between a quake that ends a sequence and a quake that warns of a bigger one to come? The answer is more unsettling than you might think. Part 10. Foreshock or aftershock. Here is the most haunting fact in all of earthquake science, and once you understand it, you will understand why no one could give the people of Palu a clean answer on the night of June 15th. A foreshock and an ordinary earthquake look exactly the same at the moment they happen. There is no special signature, no warning label, no flag that says this one is different, this one comes before something bigger. A foreshock only becomes a foreshock in hindsight after the larger earthquake it preceded has already struck. Until that moment, it is just an earthquake, indistinguishable from any other, and that means that on the night it happened, no one could say with certainty whether the 6.7 near Palu was the main event or merely the opening act. Let me give you the tool seismologists actually use to think about this, because they are elegant, and because we have built them up on this channel before, so some of this will be familiar ground. The first tool is a pattern called Barth's Law, and it describes the relationship between a main shock and its largest aftershock. As a rough rule, the biggest aftershock of an earthquake tends to run about 1.2 magnitude units below the main shock. So if the 6.7 near Palu was the main shock, Barth's Law would predict its largest aftershock landing somewhere in the mid-5s, and that is exactly what was observed. An aftershock around magnitude 5.2 following close behind. That is textbook behaviour. That is the comforting reading. The reading in which the 6.7 was the main event, and the 5.2 was its expected companion. The second tool is called Mori's Law, and it describes how aftershocks fade over time. After a main shock, the aftershocks come fast and frequent at first, then taper off, their rate decaying roughly in proportion to 1 over the time elapsed. The first hours and days are the busiest, the most dangerous for aftershocks, and then the sequence gradually quiets. By Mori's Law, the days right after June 15th were when you would expect the most aftershock activity, and a decaying sequence, one that gets quieter over time, is the signature of a normal main shock aftershock pattern, a system settling back down. The third tool is the broadest, the Gutenberg-Richter relationship, which simply says that for every large earthquake there are many more small ones, in a predictable ratio. It is the statistical backbone that lets scientists estimate how many quakes of each size to expect in a sequence. Put these three together, Barth's Law, Mori's Law, and Gutenberg-Richter, and you have a framework for reading an unfolding earthquake sequence and asking whether it is behaving like a normal, decaying aftershock sequence, or like something more ominous. But here is the trap, and it is the reason no framework can give you certainty. All of these are statistical patterns, descriptions of how sequences usually behave, not guarantees about any single case. And the most unsettling fact of all is this. Only a small fraction of earthquakes turn out to be foreshocks, but some of them do, and you cannot identify which ones in advance. The base rate is low. The large majority of moderate earthquakes are not followed by something bigger. But low is not zero, and in a place with the history of Palu, even a low probability of something larger is enough to keep everyone awake. And there is a precedent that makes this impossible to wave away, one we have touched on before when we looked at the Great Subduction Zones. In 2011, off the coast of Japan, after the catastrophic magnitude 9 earthquake that caused the Tohoku disaster, the region kept producing powerful aftershocks for a long time, including events up in the magnitude 7 range. Quakes that on any other day would themselves be major disasters, arriving as mere aftershocks of the giant. The point is that big earthquakes can have big children, that the relationship between one quake and the next can stretch across time and reach surprising magnitudes, and that a sequence is not necessarily finished just because the first large shock has passed. The crust does not read our expectations, so apply all of this to Palu. The optimistic reading is available and it is reasonable. The 6.7 was the main shock, the 5.2 was its Barth's Law aftershock, the sequence is decaying per Mori's Law, and the region is settling. That is the most likely single outcome, and I want to say that clearly, because fear should never outrun the evidence. The most probable future is that this was a major but ultimately self-contained earthquake, and that the ground near Palu gradually quiets. If you live in that region, that is the most likely path, and it is worth holding on to. But the most likely outcome is not the only possible outcome, and that is the whole reason for vigilance. There remains a real, if smaller, possibility that the 6.7 was not the main event at all, that it was a foreshock, that the stresses it relieved on one strand were loaded onto another, and that something larger is still to come on this fast-tangled, dangerous fault system. No one can rule that out, because no one can identify a foreshock until it is too late to call it anything else. And that is the precise knife-edge uncertainty that the people watching this region have to live with. Not panic, not false comfort. A clear-eyed acceptance that the most likely path is a quieting sequence, and that the small remaining chance of something worse cannot be dismissed, because the ground has earned the benefit of the doubt the hard way. There is one more clue, though, one more thing the aftershocks themselves might be telling us, if we look not just at their size but at where they are going. Because aftershocks are not scattered at random. They move, they migrate, and the direction they spread can hint at where the stress is being pushed, and which segment of this fault system might be loading toward its own day. To understand why no one could give the people of Palu a clean answer, it helps to know the one time the world thought it had cracked earthquake prediction, and what happened next, because it is one of the most sobering stories in the history of the science. In the mid-1970s, in China, authorities watching a swarm of foreshocks and other warning signs made the extraordinary decision to evacuate a city shortly before a major earthquake struck, and many lives were saved. For a brief, hopeful moment, it looked as though earthquakes might be predictable after all, that with enough warning signs you could see the big one coming and get people out in time. The triumph was real, and the hope it created was enormous. And then, a little over a year later, a different Chinese city was struck by a catastrophic earthquake with essentially no useful warning at all, a disaster that killed an almost unimaginable number of people. There had been no convenient foreshock swarm, no clear sequence of signals to act on. The earthquake simply happened. The lesson the world drew from those two events, set side by side, was brutal and clarifying. The earlier success had depended on the luck of having clear precursors, and most earthquakes do not provide them. You cannot build a warning system on a kind of warning that usually does not appear. Short-term earthquake prediction, the dream of naming the day and the hour, was quietly recognized as something science could not reliably deliver, and the field turned toward a humbler and more honest goal. That humbler goal is called forecasting, and the distinction is the entire key to understanding what scientists can and cannot tell you about Palu. Prediction means saying a specific earthquake will strike a specific place at a specific time, and that remains essentially impossible. Forecasting means stating probabilities, saying that given what just happened, there is a certain percentage chance of an aftershock of a certain size in a certain window, the way a weather forecaster gives you a chance of rain rather than a guarantee. After a main shock, scientists really can produce useful aftershock forecasts of this kind, estimating how likely further strong shaking is in the coming days, precisely because the statistical patterns we discussed, the decay of aftershocks over time and their distribution of sizes, are dependable enough to support probabilities. What those forecasts can never do is promise you that the worst is over, or tell you for certain that a larger quake is not hiding in the sequence. So when the 6.7 struck near Palu, the most an honest scientist could offer was a forecast, not a verdict. The most likely path by far was that this was a main shock, and that its sequence would decay. A smaller but real probability existed that it was a foreshock to something larger. No amount of analysis on the night itself could collapse that uncertainty into a clean answer, because the tools to do so do not exist. The people of that region were left exactly where the science genuinely leaves everyone after a major quake, holding a probability rather than a promise, watching, and waiting to see which way the sequence would turn. And one of the things the watchers turned to, hunting for any further clue, was the pattern of the aftershocks themselves and the direction they were spreading. So where exactly were the shocks spreading after June 15th, and what might that direction be trying to tell us? Part 11. Where the aftershocks are pointing. Aftershocks are not random scatter. They are a map of stress drawn in real time if you know how to read it. When a large earthquake ruptures a patch of fault, it does not simply relieve stress, it also redistributes it, piling new strain onto the edges of the ruptured zone and onto neighbouring faults. The aftershocks then light up wherever that redistributed stress has pushed some piece of crust past its breaking point. So the pattern of aftershocks, and especially the direction they migrate over the hours and days, can be a clue, an imperfect and dangerous clue, about where the stress is heading and which segment of the fault system might be loading toward its own rupture. And around Palu, and around the wider region, the shocks were spreading. That phrase deserves to be sat with, because it captures the precise reason for unease. In the broader sequence, observers watching the region in the days before Palu had already noted activity migrating, marching southward, away from where the great 7.8 had struck, as if the stress were walking down the map looking for the next weak point. And then Palu broke, further along, in its own system, adding another node to the spreading pattern. When the shocks are spreading rather than clustering and quieting in one spot, it raises a specific worry. The worry that the stress is not being safely discharged in one place, but is being passed along a chain of faults, loading each one a little, hunting for whichever is closest to failure. Let me give you the proper name for the mechanism behind this, because it is the more rigorous cousin of the dynamic triggering we discussed earlier. It is called static stress transfer, often described through something called Coulomb stress change. Unlike dynamic triggering, which is the brief nudge of passing seismic waves, static stress transfer is a permanent change in the load on nearby faults, caused by the rupture itself shifting the crust around it. When a fault slips, the blocks of crust move, and that movement squeezes some neighbouring faults and relaxes others. The ones that get squeezed, that get pushed closer to failure, become more likely to rupture. The ones that get relaxed become less likely. It is local, it is lasting, and it is one of the main ways one earthquake genuinely raises the odds of another nearby. So here is the question that hangs over the Palu earthquake when you view it through this lens. The 6.7 was a normal faulting event, a drop on one of the stretched faults in the pull-apart zone. What did that drop do to the stress on the main Palu-Koro strand, the big sideways fault that has the proven capacity for a super shear catastrophe? Did the slip on the normal fault load the main strand, pushing it closer to its own rupture? Or did it relax it, buying a little time? This is not a question anyone can answer from a chair on the night it happened. It requires detailed modelling of the rupture geometry and the surrounding faults, the careful Coulomb calculations that take time and data. But it is the right question, and it is the question that separates idle fear from genuine concern. The honest position is that we do not yet know whether this earthquake made the dangerous strand more or less likely to go, and that uncertainty itself is a reason to watch closely rather than look away. I want to be careful here not to let the drama outrun the data, because that is the easiest mistake to make with a spreading sequence. A migrating pattern of aftershocks does not guarantee a larger earthquake is coming. Most sequences that spread and migrate still ultimately fade without producing anything bigger than the main shock. The southward march of activity could simply be the ordinary untidy way stress gets redistributed and discharged across a complex region, ending not in catastrophe, but in a slow return to quiet. The spreading is a reason to pay attention, not a prophecy of disaster. I will not stand here and tell you the next great earthquake is loaded and imminent, because the evidence does not support that, and feeding you fear you cannot act on would be a betrayal of why we do this. But I also will not tell you to ignore it, because the combination of factors here is genuinely worth respecting. You have a fast, heavily loaded transtensional fault system. You have a fresh major earthquake that just changed the stress field in ways not yet fully calculated. You have aftershocks and regional activity that have been spreading rather than simply clustering and dying. And you have a setting with a documented history of producing the worst that earthquakes can offer. None of those facts individually predicts a disaster. Together they describe a situation that earns vigilance, the kind of situation where the responsible thing is to keep the instruments trained on the region and to take the possibility of more seriously, without surrendering to panic. This is the real meaning of the title that brought you here, and I want to make it explicit before we go any further. The worst part is not the earthquake that already happened. The worst part is the uncertainty it leaves behind, the open question of where the stress went, the spreading shocks pointing in directions we cannot yet fully read, and the knowledge that this exact ground has, within memory, delivered a true catastrophe. That is what it means to say a major earthquake struck the deadliest zone, and that is not even the worst part. The worst part is everything we cannot yet rule out. And as if to underline how restless the whole planet seemed in those same hours, Palu was not the only place the Earth was stirring. While Central Sulawesi dropped, other faults and other zones around the world were sending up their own small signals, and to a watchful eye it could feel as though the entire planet had decided to move at once. So before we draw this together, I want to take you on a quick tour of everything else that was twitching on the night Palu broke, and then I want to tell you honestly how much of that you should actually worry about. There is a more precise way to think about how one earthquake reshapes the danger around it, and it goes beyond just watching where the aftershocks pop up. When a fault slips, the calculation scientists run produces a kind of map, sometimes described as a butterfly or a four-leaf pattern, showing which surrounding areas have been pushed closer to failure and which have been relaxed. Around a rupture, some lobes of crust get loaded, their stress increased, made more likely to break. Other lobes get unloaded, placed in what is sometimes called a stress shadow, made less likely to break, at least for a while. So an earthquake does not simply raise the danger everywhere around it. It raises the danger in some directions and lowers it in others in a pattern set by the geometry of the slip. This is why the question of what the Palu 6.7 did to its neighbours is not answerable with a shrug or a gut feeling. It depends on exactly how the fault slipped and exactly how the surrounding faults are oriented, the kind of thing that requires careful modelling with real data, not a snap judgment on the night. The main Palu Koro strand, the dangerous sideways fault with the proven capacity for catastrophe, might sit in a loaded lobe, nudged closer to its own rupture by the normal faulting drop nearby. Or it might sit in a stress shadow, relaxed a little, granted a little time. Until the modelling is done, both remain genuinely possible, and anyone who tells you they already know which one is simply guessing. The honest limits here matter, because this is exactly the kind of science that gets oversold. Stress transfer calculations are powerful, and they have in some cases correctly highlighted in advance the area where a later earthquake then struck. But they are probabilistic, not prophetic. A loaded fault is a fault with somewhat higher odds, not a fault with a scheduled rupture. Stress shadows have been broken before by earthquakes that were not supposed to come yet. So the spreading shocks and the stress transfer question together do not deliver a prediction. They deliver a reason to watch a particular fault system with particular attention, which is exactly what the careful people were doing. And that careful attention is the whole point, because it is the difference between useful vigilance and useless panic. Knowing that the shocks are spreading, that the stress field has shifted in ways not yet fully mapped, that the dangerous strand might or might not have been loaded, is not a cause for terror. It is a cause for watching closely, taking the possibility of more seriously and being ready. That is the mature response to a place like Palu, and it stands in sharp contrast to the other thing that happens on nights like this, when people look at every twitch on the planet and convince themselves the whole world is coming apart at once. Was the whole world really shaking at once, or does it just look that way? Let me separate the signal from the noise. Part 12. While Palu shook. On a night like June 15th, it can feel as though the entire planet is coming alive at once, and there is a reason for that feeling, and there is also a reason not to trust it completely. Let me give you the honest tour of everything else that was stirring while Palu dropped, and then let me do the thing that matters most, which is to tell you which of it is signal, and which of it is the ordinary background restlessness of a living planet that we simply notice more when we are already alarmed. To the north, along the underwater trench systems near Japan, there were small stirrings. There was a little movement noted along the Nankai Trough, a zone that carries its own fearsome reputation as a future source of great earthquakes, and which had been notably quiet. There was activity near the Izu Trench as well. Now, a little movement on the Nankai is the kind of thing that catches a careful observer's attention, because of what that fault is capable of in the long run. But I have to be honest with you about scale. Minor activity on a major fault is not, by itself, a sign that the fault is about to unleash a great earthquake. These trenches produce small events all the time. The stirring is worth noting, the way you note a sound in the house at night, but noting is not the same as alarm, and there was nothing here that rose to the level of a genuine warning. Far across the Pacific, on the other rim of the ocean, there were twitches too. Off the coast of the Pacific Northwest of North America, not directly on the Great Cascadia Fault but near it, there was a small earthquake on a sideways fracture zone offshore, around magnitude 3.8, and some activity on the underwater ridges nearby. Those small events sit at the southern end of the Cascadia system, a region we have spent real time on before, because Cascadia is the sleeping giant of the North American coast. Once again, though, scale and honesty. A magnitude 3.8 offshore is a minor earthquake, the kind that happens constantly along these boundaries. It adds a small amount of stress to the southern end of a major system, which is genuinely worth tracking over the long run, but it is not evidence that anything is about to happen tomorrow. In the middle of the North American continent, far from any plate boundary, there was something a little more unusual, an uptick of small earthquakes in a zone called the New Madrid Seismic Zone, the buried fault system that has produced great earthquakes in the central United States in the historical past. The cluster was small in magnitude, nothing large, but the count over a day or so was higher than the usual quiet, an interesting little flurry in a place that does not flurry often. We have explored why that zone matters before, and why it is so dangerous despite being so far from any ocean trench. But again, a swarm of small quakes is not a great earthquake, and these zones do produce occasional bursts of minor activity that fade without consequence. And then there was a genuine large earthquake the same day, completely unrelated to Palu, on the other side of the world. There was a magnitude 6.7 reported in Turkey, far away across Asia, on an entirely different set of faults, driven by an entirely different collision of plates. It is a remarkable coincidence. 2 major earthquakes of nearly the same size on the same day, one near Palu and one in Turkey, and it is exactly the kind of coincidence that fuels the feeling that the whole planet is convulsing. But it is, almost certainly, a coincidence. Turkey and Sulawesi are not connected. A 6.7 in one cannot meaningfully load a fault in the other. They simply happen to break on the same day, the way 2 unrelated things sometimes do. So here is the honest accounting, and it is the most important habit I can give you for reading nights like this. The Earth produces major earthquakes, the magnitude 6 and larger kind, on the order of once every couple of days, somewhere on the planet all the time as a baseline. So in any given week, you will almost always be able to find several large quakes scattered around the globe, plus countless small ones, plus minor stirrings on famous faults, if you go looking for them. When something big and frightening happens, like Palu, we suddenly start looking, and we find all the ordinary background activity that was there the whole time, and it feels like the planet has gone into revolt. Most of it is not revolt. Most of it is the normal, ceaseless restlessness of a living world, made visible by our sudden attention. That does not mean nothing is connected. It means the skill, the entire discipline, is in telling the genuine connections from the illusory ones. The spreading sequence in the Philippines and Indonesia, the 7.8 and the 6s and the Palu 6.7, those share a region and a setting and the real physics of triggering, and they deserve to be watched as a related story. The Nankai stir, the Cascadia twitch, the New Madrid flurry, the Turkey quake, those are mostly the background hum, the planet doing what it always does, unconnected to Palu except in our pattern-hungry imaginations. The art is not to connect everything, and it is not to connect nothing. It is to connect exactly what the evidence supports, and to be ruthlessly honest about the rest. It is worth naming the mental glitch that makes nights like this feel apocalyptic, because once you see it, you can never quite be fooled by it again. Psychologists call it salience, and it works like this. When something frightening grabs your attention, you suddenly start noticing every related thing, and because you're now looking, you find plenty, and the abundance you find feels like a surge even though it was always there. After a big earthquake, you start scanning the global feeds, and you discover that the planet is, on any given day, dotted with quakes and stirrings and swarms, and it feels like a sudden eruption of activity. It is not. It is the normal background, finally being looked at. The activity did not spike. Your attention did. This same glitch is the engine behind old ideas like earthquake weather, the folk belief that certain conditions in the sky come before quakes. The belief survives not because it is true, but because of how memory works. On the rare occasions a quake follows some memorable weather, people remember the match and tell the story. On the countless occasions the same weather produces nothing. No one notices and no one tells anyone. The hits get remembered, the misses get forgotten, and a false pattern takes on the feel of a law. The cure is the same in every case, which is to compare what you're seeing against the honest baseline of how often these things happen anyway, rather than against the blank slate of a mind that only just started paying attention tonight. So hold the baseline in your mind as the antidote. The planet produces major earthquakes regularly, minor ones constantly, and stirrings on famous faults all the time, whether or not anyone is watching. The skill is not to be unmoved by genuine danger, but to know which of the night's many tremors actually belong to the same story, and which are simply the ordinary pulse of a restless world that you happen to be listening to more closely than usual right now. Which brings us finally back to the one place that genuinely earns our concern, and to what this whole long night actually adds up to. Because when you strip away the coincidences and the background noise, what remains is still a real and serious thing, and it is worth naming clearly before we close. So what does the Palu earthquake of June 15th truly mean, once we have separated the signal from the noise? Part 13, What Not the Worst Part really means. Whenever the Earth does something frightening in several places at once, a particular set of explanations rises up to meet it, and I want to walk through them honestly, because dismissing people's instincts with a sneer teaches them nothing, and pretending the instincts are correct when they are not is its own kind of lie. So let me take the most common alternative theories about a night like June 15th seriously enough to actually examine them, and then show you what the evidence says. The first theory is the one we have circled all night, the idea that all of these earthquakes are connected, that the Ring of Fire is waking up, that some single force is driving the 7.8, and the 6s and the Palu quake and the Turkey quake and the rest, all at once. I understand the pull of this idea completely, because the alternative, a world where the ground just breaks in many places independently, feels more chaotic and less governed than we would like. But the science is clear, and we have already built the case. The events sit on separate fault systems, and most of them are statistically independent. The one genuine thread of connection, dynamic and static stress interaction, within the Philippine and Indonesian sequence, is real but limited. A matter of neighbouring faults nudging neighbouring faults, not a planet-wide awakening commanded by a hidden hand. The honest verdict is that your pattern recognition is half right, that there is some genuine connection inside the regional cluster, and that the grander vision of a single global trigger is the mind filling a frightening gap with a story. The second theory is darker and stickier, the idea that someone predicted this and covered it up, that the authorities knew and stayed silent. And here the truth is almost the exact opposite of the suspicion, which is what makes it worth confronting directly. The warning about this region was not hidden. After the 2018 disaster, scientists studied that earthquake, discovered its record-breaking super-shear rupture, and in 2019 they published an open warning that complex faults like this one might carry an underestimated hazard. That warning sat in the scientific literature, reported around the world, available to anyone. Science did warn. The problem is not suppression. The problem is that a warning about long-term hazard is simply not the same thing as a prediction of a specific earthquake on a specific date, because no one on Earth can make that second kind of prediction. The knowledge was public. It just does not come in the form people wish it did, a date and a time and a place. It comes as a probability, a vulnerability, a region to watch, and that is a harder thing to act on than a prophecy. The third theory is the one that attaches itself to nearly every large earthquake in this part of the world. The claim that the quake was somehow manufactured, set off by a secret facility, or a weapon, or some deliberate human act. I will treat it with the same honesty as the others, by looking at the actual energy involved. A magnitude 6.7 earthquake releases an amount of energy that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. The product of decades to centuries of tectonic strain, accumulating along a known plate boundary fault, and then released in seconds. There is no facility on Earth, no device, that can inject that quantity of energy into the crust at will. And the fingerprint of this quake, that beach ball we read so carefully, the clean normal faulting mechanism on a known fault in a known transtensional zone, is exactly what natural tectonics produces, and nothing like what an artificial source would look like. The supershear phenomenon, similarly, is not exotic weapons physics. It is a documented natural behaviour of certain ruptures, observed on real faults around the world. The manufactured earthquake theory does not fail because authorities say so. It fails because the energy budget and the physics leave no room for it. So with the alternative theories set in their proper place, examined rather than mocked, and found wanting against the evidence, we can finally say plainly what the Palu earthquake of June 15th actually means, and why the title that brought you here is the literal truth rather than a tease. The earthquake itself, the shaking, the cracked houses, the frightened crowds in the street was survivable. It was, by the brutal standards of this place, the smaller story. The larger story, the part that genuinely earns concern, is everything the earthquake leaves unresolved. It struck a fault system that is fast, heavily loaded and tangled, capable of breaking sideways at record speed or dropping straight down through extension. It struck a region with a documented capacity for super shear rupture, for liquefaction that swallows neighbourhoods, and for tsunamis born from landslides in an amplifying bay. And it changed the stress field in ways no one has yet fully calculated, while the aftershocks spread rather than simply settling. That is what it means to say a major earthquake struck the deadliest zone, and that is not even the worst part. The worst part is not a prediction of doom, because I will not give you a prediction I cannot honestly make. The worst part is the honest weight of the uncertainty, the open question of where the stress went, the spreading shocks we cannot fully read, the foreshock we cannot rule out, and the proven, terrible history of a place that has earned every ounce of our attention. The worst part is that the most important questions about this earthquake do not have answers yet, and in a place like Palu, not knowing is its own kind of danger. If prediction is impossible, and only forecasting and probabilities remain, you might reasonably ask what good any of this science is, and the answer is that it is enormously good, just not in the way people wish. The payoff of understanding a place like Palu is not a magic alarm that tells you to run on a specific night. The payoff is preparedness, the slow, unglamorous work that actually saves lives when the ground finally moves. Knowing that a region sits on a fast, dangerous transtensional fault system with a history of catastrophe tells you to build differently, to write stronger building codes and actually enforce them, so that homes and schools can ride out a hard jolt instead of folding. It tells you to map the tsunami zones and mark the evacuation routes and drill the population, so that when a wave rises in a bay, people already know which way is up and out. Indonesia learned a great deal from the 2018 disaster, and much of that learning is exactly this kind, the kind that does not predict the next quake but blunts its impact. Understanding how the bay amplified the wave, how the warning systems failed against a landslide tsunami, how the liquefaction zones mapped onto the worst-hit neighbourhoods, all of that feeds into where people should and should not build, into how warnings should be issued, into how communities prepare for a repeat. None of it can stop the fault from breaking. All of it can change how many people are still standing when it does. That is the real, usable product of taking a hazard seriously, and it is why the honest scientific stance, the one that refuses to promise predictions it cannot deliver, is not a counsel of despair but a foundation for action. And this is where honest uncertainty turns out to be more useful than false certainty, which is the opposite of what most people assume. A confident prediction that turns out wrong is worse than useless, because it burns the public's trust and teaches people to ignore the next warning. An honest probability, clearly stated, lets people calibrate, prepare proportionately, and keep faith with the experts the next time. When scientists say the most likely outcome near Palu is a decaying sequence, with a smaller real chance of something worse, they are not failing to do their job. They are doing it correctly, handing people the truth in the only shape it actually comes in, so that those people can make sound decisions rather than chase a certainty that does not exist. That humility is not weakness. It is the discipline that keeps the science trustworthy. There is a strange and almost unbearable poetry in how this earthquake chose to break, and I want to end there, with the single image that, for me, captures everything unsettling and everything humbling about this night. Because the way this ground failed is not just a technical detail, it is a kind of message, if we are willing to read it. Part 14. The Fault That Changed Its Mind. Years ago, the ground beneath Palu tore sideways. It ripped along its fault faster than its own waves could carry the news, a rupture breaking a speed limit that scientists had thought was nearly unbreakable, and in doing so it killed thousands through shaking and water and liquefied earth. That was how this place announced itself to the world, with a sideways tear at record speed. And now, in the same haunted zone, only a few miles away, the ground has broken again, and it has broken in almost the opposite way. It did not tear sideways this time. It pulled apart and a block of crust dropped into the widening gap. The fault, if you will let me put it this way for just a moment, seems to have changed its mind about how to fail. That image is more than a turn of phrase because it points at the genuine mystery sitting at the bottom of this whole story. A simple fault has a personality, a consistent way of breaking, a habit the experts can read and brace for. The ground beneath Palu has no such simplicity. It can shear sideways at super shear speed, and it can stretch and drop in quiet extension, and it can do both within the same small stretch of crust, because it is not one fault but a tangle, a transtensional knot where shearing and stretching happen at once. And a tangle is the hardest thing in all of seismology to predict, because the rules that let you forecast a simple fault blur and dissolve when the crust can fail in more than one direction. So what is the system telling us with this strange change of mechanism? Is the extension we just saw, the pulling apart, a sign that stress is being relieved in one part of the knot, buying a little time on the dangerous main strand? Or is it a sign that the whole tangle is being reorganized, loaded, reshuffled, with the stress quietly migrating toward the segment that will fail next? The way the spreading aftershocks might be hinting? Is Central Sulawesi slowly reloading toward another great rupture, perhaps another super shear monster, or is it simply breathing, releasing strain in ordinary increments the way an active fault zone does for centuries between its rare catastrophes? The honest, humbling, almost maddening answer is that no one can say. Not yet. Maybe not until the system itself decides. And that uncertainty, I want to suggest, is not a failure of science. It is the actual shape of the truth. We have learned an enormous amount about this place. We can read the beach ball and decode the rake and name the mechanism. We can map the pull-apart basin and measure the speed of the fault and reconstruct, in haunting detail, exactly how a sideways rupture drowned a city it had no textbook right to drown. We can separate the genuine regional connections from the coincidences and dismantle the conspiracy theories with the cold arithmetic of energy. We know so much, and still, standing at the edge of June 15th, 2026, with the instruments warm and the aftershock spreading, we cannot tell you the one thing everyone most wants to know, which is what happens next. The Earth keeps that to itself. There is a humility in that, and I think it is the right note to end on, because it is the truest thing this whole story has to teach. We share a planet with forces that are vastly older and vastly more powerful than we are, forces that loaded the Palu Kora fault grain by grain over thousands of years and released it in seconds, forces that can break the speed of their own waves and lift the sea from a fault that should not lift it. We have learned to listen to those forces, to read their fingerprints, to understand them better than any generation before us. But understanding is not the same as controlling, and reading the warning is not the same as knowing the hour. The ground beneath Palu has shown us twice now that it will break on its own schedule and in its own way, and that the most we can do is watch and prepare and respect what it is capable of. There is a humbling mismatch of time built into all of this, and it is worth sitting with before we close. The Palu Kora fault loaded the strain it released in 2018 over hundreds, even thousands of years, grain by grain, far slower than any human lifetime. It released that strain in seconds. We, the watchers, live somewhere in between, remembering a few decades, reacting in real time, trying to make sense of a process that runs on a clock so much slower and so much older than our own. A fault does not care that 2018 feels like recent history to us. To the fault, the years since are barely an instant, a single breath between one motion and the next. That mismatch is why these places can lull a population into forgetting, and why the forgetting is so dangerous. The danger does not fade on a human schedule. It only feels like it does. That is precisely why the act of watching matters, and why I do not think it is morbid to keep our attention trained on a place like this. Watching is not the same as fearing. The people who keep the instruments running, who model the stress changes, who update the forecasts, who walk the evacuation routes, are not catastrophizing. They are doing the one thing a species with our short memory can do against a process with such a long one, which is to refuse to look away just because the last disaster has slipped out of the headlines. Attention is the bridge across the mismatch of time. It is how we hold on to a danger that the years would otherwise erase. And there is a kind of dignity in doing that, watching without panic, which is the balance I've been trying to strike all night. Panic is useless, because it burns out, and a population that is terrified today will be numb and forgetful tomorrow, which is the worst possible state for a place that will not break on any schedule we can foresee. Steady, clear-eyed vigilance is the opposite. It can be sustained for years, for decades, for as long as the fault makes us wait. It does not demand that you be afraid. It only asks that you respect what the ground is capable of, that you take the precautions that respect implies, and that you keep your attention on the places that have earned it. Palu has earned it twice over. So keep your eyes on this region in the days ahead, the way the careful people are keeping theirs. Watch whether the sequence quiets, as it most likely will, or whether the shocks keep spreading towards something larger, as on rare occasions they do. Hold both possibilities at once without panic and without false comfort, because that knife edge between them is simply where the honest truth lives right now. A major earthquake struck Indonesia's deadliest zone on the night of June 15th. The shaking has stopped. The questions have not. And in a place that has already shown the world exactly what it can do, the silence after an earthquake has never been something to mistake for safety. It is only the sound of a fault somewhere far below deciding what to do next.